On a gray October morning in the hill country of southern Missouri, a 71-year-old farmer named Thurgood Aldous Pruitt stood at the edge of a pond he had not seen the bottom of in 41 years. He'd fed it, fished it, watched his grandchildren swim in it, and buried a dog beside it. But that morning, as the last of the water gurgled down a drainage pipe he'd installed the day before, Thurgood was about to learn that the thing living at the bottom of his pond had been waiting on him a lot longer than 41 years. What the mud gave up that day would bring geologists, a county sheriff, and eventually a television crew to a gravel road that until then had never seen a stranger's car. Stick around, because before we get to what was down there, you need to understand the pond itself, and trust me, the story only gets stranger. If tales like this are your kind of thing, hit subscribe now so you don't miss the next one. Let's get into it. Thurgood Pruitt didn't dig his pond. He inherited it, the same way he inherited the 240 acres of fescue and red clay that made up Pruitt Hollow Farm, tucked between two ridgelines outside a town so small it didn't have a stoplight, only a four-way stop with a rusted stop sign that had been shot full of holes by 3 generations of teenagers with 22 rifles. The pond had been there before Thurgood's father, before his grandfather, a man named Ezariah Pruitt, who'd come down from Kentucky in a wagon in 1911 and staked a claim on the hollow because a spring-fed creek ran through the bottom of it, cold and steady, even in August. Within his first 2 years on the land, Ezariah threw up an earthen dam across the narrow part of the hollow to back that creek up into a pond, cheap insurance for a man with cattle and no well yet dug, and a decision he apparently never wrote much about, because nobody in the family could say exactly which spring he'd dammed or why he picked that particular bend. Ezariah built his cabin near it. His son Thurgood's father built the farmhouse near it a generation later, and when Thurgood inherited the place from that same father in 1983, the pond had already been feeding cattle, watering crops, and drowning the occasional careless goose for over 70 years. For most of that time, nobody thought much about what might be sitting on the bottom. That's the thing about farm ponds in the Ozark Hill Country, they're not glamorous. They're working water. You don't drain a pond you depend on. You maintain it. You dredge the edges when they silt up. You stock it with bass and bluegill, and you let the ducks do what ducks do. A pond like that is infrastructure, not mystery. Thurgood grew up on that water the way most farm kids in that part of Missouri grew up on theirs. He learned to swim in it before he learned to drive a tractor. He'd hauled ice off it in January to pack a neighbor's spring house, back before anybody out there had reliable refrigeration, and he'd spent more summer evenings than he could count sitting on the tailgate of his father's truck at the edge of the dam, watching bats work the surface for mosquitoes as the sun dropped behind the ridge. When his own kids were young, in the 70s, he'd built a rope swing off the big sycamore that leaned out over the deep end, the same tree family photographs suggest that Ezariah himself might have planted as a sapling not long after the dam went up. 3 generations of Pruitts had a version of the same memory, cannonballing off that bank into water so tan and dark you couldn't see your own hand 2 feet below the surface. That darkness never struck anybody as strange. Ozark ponds run that color naturally, stained by tannins leaching out of oak leaves and cedar duff, and a farmer who'd swum in the same brown water his whole life had no particular reason to wonder what a few extra feet of visibility might have shown him. The pond simply was what it was, a fixture of the land, older than anyone living, and about as mysterious, most days, as the barn or the fence line. But by 2023, Thurgood's Pond had a problem. It had started to die. Here's something every landowner with a farm pond should understand, because it's the reason this story happened at all: pond's age. It's a slow, quiet kind of death, called eutrophication. Over decades, leaves fall in. Cattle wade through and stir up sediment. Fertilizer runoff from nearby fields washes nutrients into the water. All of that organic material sinks and breaks down, and every year the bottom gets a little higher, the water gets a little shallower, and algae gets a little more aggressive because it's got more nutrients to feed on. A pond that was 12 feet deep when your grandfather dug it can be 4 feet deep 60 years later, and you'd never know it just by looking at the surface, because the water still looks like water. By the summer of 2023, Thurgood's Pond had turned the color of pea soup every July. The bass he used to catch were smaller. The oxygen dropped so low some summers that he'd wake up to a dozen dead bluegill floating belly up along the bank. His neighbor, a soil conservation officer named Wendelene Okafor Marsh, who worked out of the county extension office, had been telling him for 2 years that the pond needed to be drained, dredged, and reset, pumped dry, scraped down to the clay, and refilled clean. Thurgood resisted. 41 years is a long time to leave something alone. But in September of 2023, after losing nearly his entire fish population in a single hot spell, he finally called Wendelene and told her to set it up. Draining a pond that size isn't as simple as pulling a plug. Wendeline's crew set up a diesel trash pump at the low corner of the dam, the kind used to dewater construction sites, and ran a discharge line down into the hollow's creek bed so the water wouldn't flood Thurgood's hayfield. It took 4 days of steady pumping to get the water level down far enough to see the old creek channel that ran under the pond, the original stream bed that had been there before Ezariah Pruitt ever dammed it up. Thurgood walked out to the bank every morning during those 4 days with his coffee, watching the water line creep down the clay walls like a tide going out and never coming back. The pump ran day and night, a steady diesel throb that Thurgood said later he could still hear in his sleep for a week afterward, and by the end of the first day the water had dropped low enough to expose a ring of black, oxygen-starved muck along the banks that hadn't seen daylight in decades. It didn't smell like a pond anymore. It smelled, Wendelene told him, like a wound that had been kept closed too long, finally being opened. On the second day, the pump operator, a wiry younger man named Castellan Briggs, who did seasonal work for the extension office, found the first thing: a hand-forged iron trap, the kind used a century ago for muskrat and mink, so corroded it crumbled when he lifted it out of the mud. Somebody's granddaddy lost that a long time ago, Thurgood said, and didn't think much of it. By the third day, with maybe 1.5 feet of murky water left covering an acre of exposed mudflat, Castellan found something else: a scatter of rusted farm implements half swallowed by silt, an old plow blade, a broken wagon wheel rim, the kind of debris that tends to accumulate at the bottom of any pond that sat on a working farm for 100 years. Interesting, but not strange. It was on the morning of the 4th day, with the pump finally running dry and sucking air, that Thurgood walked down into what was left of his pond boots, sinking to the ankle in black muck that smelled like rotten eggs from decades of anaerobic decay, and saw something breaking the surface of the mud near the old creek channel that made him stop cold. It looked at first like a fallen tree trunk, gray and half-buried, roughly the length of a canoe, but tree trunks don't have ribs. Thurgood didn't touch it. 41 years of farming teaches a man when to leave something alone, and this was one of those times. He walked back up to the house, called Wendeline, and told her there was something in the mud that looked like bones, big ones. Wendeline drove out within the hour, and when she saw what was partially exposed in the drained mudflat, she made a call of her own to a paleontologist at a university 2 hours north named Dr. Iolanthe Draycott, who specialized in Pleistocene-era megafauna of the American Midwest. What emerged over the following 2 weeks, as Dr. Draycott and a small team carefully excavated the site by hand, was the nearly complete skeleton of a giant ground sloth, an animal that stood roughly 9 feet tall on its hind legs, with claws the length of a man's forearm, and that had gone extinct in North America somewhere between 10 and 11,000 years ago. This is the part of the story worth slowing down for, because it's genuinely one of the more remarkable things that can happen to an ordinary piece of American farmland. Giant ground sloths, animals in the genus Megalonyx, first scientifically described from a specimen found in what is now West Virginia, once roamed across nearly all of what would become the continental United States, from the Gulf Coast up into the Ozarks and beyond. They were slow-moving herbivores, browsing on leaves and tough vegetation, and their claws, which looked like weapons, were more likely used for pulling down tree branches than for hunting. They went extinct at the end of the last ice age, along with mammoths, mastodons, and dozens of other large mammals, in a wave of extinctions that scientists still debate the causes of climate change, human hunting pressure, or some combination of both. What made Thurgood's Pond special wasn't just that a sloth skeleton was there. Fossils of Ice Age megafauna turn up periodically across the Midwest and South, usually in caves, riverbanks, or sinkholes where conditions preserve bone for thousands of years. What made this discovery unusual was the state of preservation. The original creek channel beneath Thurgood's Pond had, at some point roughly 10,000 years ago, been a boggy sinkhole, the kind of low-oxygen, waterlogged environment that can preserve not just bone, but soft tissue. Dr. Draycott's team found fragments of preserved hide and even sloth dung, called coprolites, still intact enough to be analyzed for pollen and plant material, giving researchers a rare window into exactly what the Ozark landscape looked like at the end of the Ice Age. In other words, the very same spring-fed low spot that made Ezariah Pruitt want to build his pond there in 1911 was the same low spot that had trapped and preserved a giant ground sloth 10,000 years earlier. The water that watered 4 generations of Pruitt cattle sat directly on top of a creature that had walked those hills back when mammoths still grazed a few miles away. Here's where the story takes its strangest turn, and it's the part that brought a sheriff's deputy out to Pruitt Hollow Farm. 2 days into the excavation, while sifting through mud near the sloth's rib cage, one of Dr. Draycott's graduate students, a young woman named Persimmon Vasquez Holt, uncovered something that had no business being anywhere near a 10,000-year-old skeleton: a corroded brass button, the kind used on a men's work coat, and beside it, a pocket knife with a bone handle, clearly nowhere near as old as the sloth bones it was resting against. For a tense afternoon, there was real concern on site that they'd stumbled onto something far more recent and far more troubling, that the sinkhole beneath the pond might have swallowed more than one thing over the centuries, and that the button and knife belonged to a person, not an animal. The county sheriff's office was notified as a precaution, standard procedure any time human artifacts turn up unexpectedly at a site under excavation. The answer when it came, was almost anticlimactic, but it closed a 100-year-old mystery in the Pruitt family. Records at the county courthouse, along with a diary kept by Ezariah Pruitt's wife, Verlinda, confirmed what had happened. In the winter of 1923, a hired hand who worked the farm had gone missing after telling neighbors he was heading north to find work in the lead mines. Family legend always assumed he'd simply left. But the knife, later confirmed through the courthouse's handwritten property records to match a description in an old insurance claim Ezariah had filed for lost tools, suggested the hand had likely fallen through thin pond ice while working near the bank in the dead of winter, and never resurfaced, his body decomposing over the following century in the same low-oxygen mud that had preserved the sloth for 10,000 years, until nothing recognizably human remained except a knife and a button. No human remains were ever recovered. Dr. Dracott's working theory is that Ezariah's dam, built barely a decade before Solomon Petrakis died, had actually changed the chemistry of the pond bottom, raising oxygen levels near the surface layers of mud, even as the much deeper, older sinkhole sediment stayed sealed and airless. In other words, the same dam that made the pond useful for the Pruitt family also made its upper mud a far worse preservative than the ancient bog beneath it. A century of that shallower, more oxygen-exposed soil is not kind to bone, which is likely why nothing of Solomon remained except what didn't rot, a brass button and a bone-handled knife. But for Thurgood, whose family had wondered for 100 years what happened to a hired man named Solomon Petrakis, it was, in its own way, an answer nobody had expected to find at the bottom of a farm pond. For any of you watching who manage your own pond or are thinking about one, here's the part worth remembering. What happened at Pruitt Hollow Farm is rare, but the process that led to it isn't. Every farm pond sits on top of a slice of land history, sometimes geological, sometimes personal and periodic maintenance. The kind Thurgood put off for 4 decades is often the only way anyone ever finds out what's actually down there. Extension offices across the country, like the one Wendeline Okafor Marsh works for, generally recommend a full pond assessment every 10 to 15 years, checking sediment depth, water clarity, and dam integrity, well before a pond reaches the kind of crisis point that forced Thurgood's hand. A few practical signs Wendeline tells landowners not to ignore. Water that turns green and stays green well past midsummer, fish that seem to be shrinking generation over generation, a dam that develops damp patches or slumping on its downhill face, and the one that got Thurgood's attention, a summer fish kill after a hot, still night. That last one is usually a sign of an oxygen crash, which happens when a pond has aged enough that its bottom sediment is consuming more oxygen, breaking down organic matter than the water can hold, especially once a thick mat of algae is also competing for it after dark. None of those signs mean a pond is hiding a prehistoric skeleton, but they do mean the pond is trying to tell its owner something, and Thurgood, by his own admission, ignored his for the better part of a decade before he finally listened. As for the sloth, its bones were donated to the university for research and eventual display, with Thurgood's name formally credited in the discovery record. The Pruitt Pond specimen, as it's now known in academic papers, is considered one of the better preserved megalonyx finds east of the Mississippi in the last 30 years. The pond itself was dredged, reset, and refilled the following spring, restocked with bass and bluegill, and today looks, to anyone driving past, like an unremarkable farm pond in the Ozark Hills. Thurgood still walks out to it most mornings with his coffee. He says he doesn't think about what's still down there in the mud. He didn't dig up the excavation, only cleared about a third of the original sinkhole before winter weather ended the season, and Dr. Dracott's team has said they'd like to come back. But every now and then, he told a local reporter, he looks out at the water and wonders what else 41 years or 10,000 years might be hiding under a pond everybody thought they already knew. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because next week we're heading to a tobacco farm in North Carolina, where a collapsed barn floor revealed something that had been sealed up since before the Civil War, and trust me, that one gets even stranger. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.